Was the Soviet Union state capitalist, or was it socialist? Before we begin, I'd like to pose a question in response to this question. What is the point of this question? Why do people, more specifically Western leftists, seek to deny the legitimacy of socialism in the Soviet Union and other existing socialist states? Over the course of the last century, the powers that be have inseminated so much anti-communist propaganda across the West, more specifically the United States, that many here on the American left have internalized said propaganda and, as a consequence, dismissed the Soviet Union and actually existing socialism, since not only is it an unpopular opinion to uphold, it is also a difficult position to uphold as well, since to debunk a lot of the propaganda requires hours and hours of historical research. Many Western leftists work overtime to distance themselves from the word communism, since when one hears this word, piles of dead reactionaries, gulags, and breadlines tend to be the first images that come to mind. And thus, one of the most popular tactics used by many Western leftists, logically fallacious though well-meaning they might be, is to deny the Soviet Union was ever socialist in the first place. Well, that's not real socialism, they say. It's just state capitalism. And within moments, the Western leftist has just rationalized away the need to uphold and defend socialism in practice.
Any respected historian and theorist recognizes that the Soviet Union was actually state capitalism in the extreme. It never achieved any level of theoretical socialism, and certainly not communism. And if you look at the writings of Vladimir Lenin, he admits to this fact.
But for me, coming out of the Marxian tradition, which I learned from and which I have found very useful in this way, there is another stage to human development that hasn't been accomplished, neither in Russia nor in China. And that is the transformation of the workplace.
What ideology? The ideology of totalitarianism? Yeah, it's deeply flawed. I mean, they were the initial modern totalitarians. It's not anything to do with socialism. They destroyed socialism within weeks. You know, they didn't wait. By 1918, it was finished. And they knew it, you know, like it's not a secret. They knew it. I mean, in fact, Lenin, as soon as he sort of got drips of things after he moved to what he called state capitalism.
And the theory of state capitalism, as developed by Tony Cliff, who was one of the founding members of the International Socialists, what became the SWP, it enabled that group to explain why these regimes were not only not socialist, but not progressive either.
Yeah, so what we're talking about is whether or not the USSR was socialist. You obviously think it was, I obviously think it wasn't. I had given a quick premise and you were then just kind of responding to that, so I'll just go over my premise and you can repeat your argument there. I don't think
So the only point I'm getting across here is that there seems like there are a lot of parallels here that don't meaningfully address the underlying problem that, for all of its talk and pretense, the Soviet Union never really meaningfully did anything that it claimed to do.
I rest my case. The problem with this bad faith angle of argumentation is, number one, the Western leftist can redefine socialism to mean whatever they want as to make their ideal economic model unfalsifiable, since it has never existed and cannot be tested against the pressures of the real world. Number two, right-wingers will still make that equivocation anyways because they see this response for the cop-out that it is. And number three, it is an arrogant and ignorant presumption to assume that you or I know better on how to build true socialism than, say, Fidel Castro or Thomas Sankara or Mao Zedong, three men whom had spent their entire lives as hardened veteran revolutionaries working overtime against impossible odds to construct a society free of exploitation. So what I have to say is if right-wingers are going to pin the failures and shortcomings of really existing socialism on us no matter what, then why should we eschew the scarlet letter brandished upon our breasts? Why not embrace it and learn about those regimes so that one can more adequately address their arguments? I mean, people already think pretty weird things about us as is. Anyways, now that my left-wing anti-communist rant is over, I shall now explain the true nature of the Soviet Union's political economy. Okay, so first off, what is socialism? Before we answer this question, we need to understand what economic characteristics are needed to classify a country as socialist or not, which means we need a scientific definition of the word.
Throughout my reading of Marxist literature over the years, I have found there to be 5 prerequisites that must be met for one to classify the economic mode of a given nation. And the following are the 5 characteristics that are unique to socialism. Number 1. The means of production have been nationalized and made public property. Private property has been abolished. Number 2. The means of production have been socialized, meaning that production has become a collective endeavor done by the whole of society. So rather than firms competing with one another for market share, they instead collaborate towards common production outputs set by planners. Wages are no longer a commodity, and goods are produced as use values first and commodities second. Number 3. The economy operates according to a plan, and goods are produced and distributed according to said plan. By extension, profits are no longer in control of society. Number 4. The state is worker-owned and controlled. Workers are the dominant class, and would-be capitalists and reactionaries are subjugated by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Number 5. The means in which surplus product is produced, extracted, and utilized takes on a different nature under socialism. In a socialist planned economy, the amount of surplus that was produced is dictated by political decisions drawn up by the economic planners, rather than by whether or not a given industry is able to turn a profit. So for example, if a firm was operating on a loss, that doesn't necessitate their bankruptcy. Conversely, if a firm is highly profitable, that doesn't guarantee them greater access to resources than neighboring enterprises just because they're making more money. So it is in this way that under socialism, money takes the back seat when it comes to economic decision making. Okay, so now that we know what makes a country socialist, how about we talk about what makes a country capitalist? Number 1, the means of production are privately owned. Private property is respected, protected, and upheld in the country's constitution. Number 2, the means of production are balkanized. Firms compete with one another for market share and produce goods as use values in pursuit of exchange value. Labor power is a commodity and is thus subject to the whims of the market. Number 3, the economy operates according to the anarchy of the market. Goods are produced and distributed according to profitability. Number 4, the state is owned and controlled and exists to address the needs of the capitalist class. Workers are the subjugated class and bourgeois rule reigns supreme. Number 5, under capitalism, the form of surplus value extraction is hidden by the contract of wage labor, and surplus value under capitalism is the difference between the value produced by workers and the value it takes for any individual worker to reproduce themselves. That is to say, pay their bills, buy groceries, car insurance, etc. Under capitalism, the worker is legally on equal footing with the capitalist, exchanging his time for a wage.
Interestingly enough, within the context of a developing capitalist economy, however, its economic nature changes the more advanced and developed that it becomes. Under bourgeois society, there is a perpetual political will resonating from the masses below to implement economic reform that redistributes wealth from firms in the form of state-sanctioned human services, for example. That is to say, social democracy, if you will. And not only that, as free market competition goes on, as some firms go under and others grow larger, as big business grows and expands, production consolidates and by extension becomes more centralized. In addition, the contradictions of capitalism also intensify, and the crises of the system grow ever more severe to the point to where we are in a situation that we are now, where the only option left for the bourgeoisie is to keep their too-big-to-fail institutions from failing, giving themselves bailout after bailout, paying themselves, and kicking the can down the road over and over again. And if you look at the advanced capitalist countries of the First World, you will find that production is heavily automated, that labor has become far more socialized, and they use heavy amounts of central planning when it comes to scientific developments and innovation. Remember, most new technology actually comes from public sector investment, not private sector investment. So it is in this way that, as a general rule of thumb, the more advanced that a capitalist country becomes, the more its mode of production begins to resemble that of socialism. And all of the aforementioned trends that have transpired are the silent admission by the capitalist class that socialism is a better economic mode, since as time goes on, their economic mode starts to look more and more like socialism. But I digress.
So now that we have defined our terms, does the Soviet Union meet the criteria to be called socialist? Well, the means of production were all nationalized in the USSR, meaning virtually all production was reined into control of the public sector. Production was socialized as well, since none of the cooperatives or enterprises were competing with one another, and instead were producing towards predetermined economic outputs based on an economic plan. Wage labor was abolished, since labor power wasn't a commodity. Goods were produced for their use value and not inherently in pursuit of exchange value. The economy operated according to a plan that was drafted every 5 years, and the state was worker-owned and controlled within the context of a representative democracy. Now, granted, the USSR's democratic process was far from perfect. It is important to note that most elected government officials, mid-managers, and bureaucrats had backgrounds as blue-collar workers. Stalin himself, for example, had origins rooted amongst the Georgian peasantry, and Brezhnev had a background as a metal worker before he rose through the ranks and became leader of the country. Now imagine that. Two of the longest ruling leaders of the Soviet Union came from humble beginnings. Meanwhile, under actually existing capitalism, more than half of Congress is comprised of millionaires and high-income individuals. And most of our elected leaders come from moneyed and business backgrounds. And since the USSR was indeed a socialist country, or rather 15 socialist countries, it did not experience any of the symptoms of capitalism, from vast, expansive, growing income inequality, to business cycles, to chronic unemployment, etc. The worst pay gap, according to some sources, was a paltry 3.5 to 1 ratio between the lowest and highest earners. The Soviets experienced linear economic growth throughout its life, of course with the exception of the Civil War and World War II, and a job was an enshrined right in their constitution. And this is the part where some may try to bring up counter-arguments against the notion that the Soviets were ever socialist, sometimes even taking quotes from Marx and Lenin out of context to prove their point. I shall now name some of them off and go on to debunk every argument made by anarchists, left-coms, Gonzaloites, and other left-wing tendencies to deny the USSR's socialist nature. Number 1. The Soviet Union was basically state capitalist because government bureaucrats constituted their own class and thus had a class interest separate from the proletariat.
False equivalence. Bureaucrats are not the same thing as capitalists. They do not own means of production, they cannot decide their own wages, nor can they decide what a factory produces according to profitability.
Nor can they exploit labor power and extract surplus value for personal enrichment.
And a high-ranking bureaucrat having a swimming pool at his house, or a car, or enjoying some caviar from time to time is a massive far cry from the situation in, say, here, the United States, where the gap between the lowest and highest earners is orders of magnitude greater than what it was in the Soviet Union.
Number 2. There was still exploitation in the USSR.
Exploitation in the Marxian definition of the term is the rate of surplus value extraction, or the difference between the reproduction cost of variable capital and the exchange value of the commodity or service produced. And since labor power is not a commodity under socialism, there can be no surplus value. Instead, social surplus is extracted from workers for the sake of the upkeep of society as well as complex economic reproduction. But in the Soviet Union, there was no proprietary class hoarding billions of dollars out of circulation for their own personal enrichment and consumption. There were no rents, there were no dividends, royalties, advertising, wage labor, stock markets, or any of the other things that you would typically find in a capitalist country.
Number 3. The Soviet Union didn't achieve socialism because it didn't achieve classlessness.
This is a new argument used by ultras to try and deny the legitimacy of Soviet socialism, and it involves, quote, sniping Lenin out of context from his article, The Economics and Politics in the Era of the Dictatorship of the Proletariat.
Quote, socialism means the abolition of classes. The dictatorship of the proletariat has done all it can to abolish classes. The classes cannot be abolished in one stroke. Unquote. Lenin.
But if you read the whole document, you will see here what Lenin is actually saying is the abolition and overthrow of exploiter classes, followed by a protracted period of the fading out of the distinctions between peasants and proletariat as production is socialized and productive forces advance.
Quote, in order to abolish classes, it is necessary first to overthrow the landowners and capitalists. This part of our task has been accomplished, but it is only part, and moreover, not the most difficult part. In order to abolish classes, it is necessary, secondly, to abolish the difference between factory worker and peasant, to make workers of all of them. This cannot be done all at once. This task is incomparably more difficult, and will of necessity take a long time. It is not a problem that can be solved by overthrowing a class. It can only be solved by the organizational reconstruction of the whole social economy, by a transition from individual, disunited, petty commodity production to large-scale social production. It may only be delayed and complicated by hasty and incautious administrative and legislative measures. It can be accelerated only by affording such assistance to the peasant as will enable him to effect an immense improvement in his whole farming technique to reform it radically.
And this is exactly what they set out to do with industrialization and collectivization. As time went on, living conditions for the peasantry would steadily improve, wage growth being most prevalent during the post-Stalin USSR for this demographic. Less and less they would need to rely on personal farms for subsistence, and more the distinctions between urban and rural workers would fade.
Number 4. The Soviet Union wasn't socialist because socialism is a global economic system, and socialism in one country contradicts this.
Socialism in one country was a necessary compromise in response to the fact that the European revolutions failed. The Soviets had no allies and were recovering from a recent civil war. So rather than continuously support international revolutionary efforts when they lacked significant presence, they decided to erect the first functioning socialist planned economy on their own. And mind you, they never abandoned international solidarity. The Soviets aided countless revolutionary groups in their efforts. From the Cubans, the Vietnamese, to the North Koreans, the Warsaw Pact, the Chinese, anarchist Catalonia, etc. And this is the part where many of the theory experts and book worshippers lose touch with reality. It is one thing to know the theory, but it is another thing to interpret it, apply it, and amend it when needed according to real-world practice. And yes, it is true. Ideally, socialism should be a global force that overthrows capitalism. However, things like imperialism and the CIA exist to hinder such efforts, and thus, in practice, socialism just can't happen everywhere at once. That's not the way it worked with capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, and that's certainly not the way it worked with feudalism after the collapse of the Roman Empire. The entire world doesn't just go from one economic mode to another. It's an evolutionary process that takes decades, possibly centuries, before the whole globe is changed. So, it's better to think of this as a protracted period where the socialist countries work together to spread socialism against the capitalist regimes who would seek their destruction.
Number 5. The Soviet Union didn't achieve socialism because it still had commodity production and participated in global trade.
Another necessary compromise. The Soviet economy would have stagnated from the get-go if they didn't participate in global trade. They needed factory equipment, machinery, and high-skilled labor to mechanize and modernize a largely backward and unindustrialized country. And again, due to the limitations of the time, commodity production was tolerated, but within a completely different context than capitalism, where there is generalized commodity production. In other words, commodity production in the pursuit of private enrichment. There was no wage labor, no surplus value extraction. Goods were produced according to a plan, and the exchange taking place between differing cooperatives does not necessarily entail an exploitative relationship. So within the context of socialism, there is no comparison with what was going on under capitalism. The abolition of commodity production and distribution according to need can only take place within the context of a higher phase of communism, since it requires far more advanced productive forces than what the Soviets had available to them at the time. So while China stands may be the living embodiment of a meme, they do have a point in this regard.
Number 6. The Soviet Union lacked direct, decentral, horizontal worker ownership since they abandoned this model after the Civil War. As Chomsky put it, they abandoned socialism within the first few months.
Having a decentralized, horizontally organized, worker-owner type state does not only do nothing to address the issues of a lack of buildup of productive forces and small-scale production. Remember, Lenin said in his own words, small-scale production engenders capitalism. But it also does nothing to keep capitalist roaders in your ranks from selling off factory equipment to private owners, cooperatives competing with one another and ignoring state quotas, and on top of all of that, Russia being invaded by a dozen countries, along with the whites waging a war of counter-revolution across the new regime. The centralization of power, as well as the top-down disciplined nature of the siege model, on the other hand, was a necessary evil in order to fend off the incoming tide of reaction. I shall once again quote David Priestland to outline this point.
Quote, "It was at this point that Lenin realized that the promises of 1917 were incompatible with the preservation of the new regime. Allowing workers and peasants to control their factories and fields and encouraging anti-bourgeois pogroms was only fueling economic chaos. Food supplies suffered from the expropriation of the gentry's land and the breakup of large estate. Meanwhile, workers used workers' control to benefit their own factories, rather than the economy as a whole, and harassed the hated managers and engineers. Labor discipline collapsed, a problem only worsened by food shortages. The ranks of the unemployment swelled, and the opposition to the Bolsheviks and the Soviets grew rapidly. It had become very clear in early 1918, as it had in France in 1793, that the goals of the popular and elite revolutionaries were diverging. But Lenin abandoned his short-lived radical Marxism for a severe modernist version. In March-April 1918, he announced his retreat from the commune state and the citizens' militia model of socialism. Quote, "The Russian worker was a bad worker compared with people in the advanced countries that could not be trusted with workers' democracy." Unquote, unquote. Priestland, The Red Flag, page 93 to 94.
These kinds of decisions are not easy when you're the only socialist nation in a world full of capitalist nations that want to see you destroyed.
Number 7. The Kosygin reforms reintroduced profitability as a factor in economic planning in certain sectors. Therefore, the Soviet Union was no longer socialist.
We are now getting into one of the points made by Maoists, more specifically Gonzaloites, whom uphold all of Mao's ideas all the way up to the final years of his life when he became a counter-revolutionary wrecker, calling the USSR a fascist dictatorship of the Hitlerite variety and siding with the United States against the Soviets. The Kosygin reform introduced profits as an indicator as to whether or not an enterprise was successful. The reform also introduced a shift towards decentral planning, giving enterprise directors and mid-managers more autonomy in the planning process at a local level. Additional profits raised by enterprises would be used to A. reward workers for their efforts, B. expand operations, and C. tax revenue. Up to this point, profits were always a thing in the Soviet Union. However, they had no bearing on whether or not an enterprise was successful, and acted more as a means to account for aggregate economic outputs, and were generally not sought for their own sake. This reform on its own did not restore capitalism, as all it did was introduce profits to encourage certain enterprise directors and workers to have greater incentive to increase productivity and curtail economic stagnation. In the end, the Lieberman reform from 1965 to 1970 yielded mixed results. There was certainly an increased economic growth while the policy was in place, and wages did in fact increase. However, the planners observed that there wasn't a commensurate rise in productivity following those rising wages, resulting in incommensurate compensation with respect to economic outputs. Ultimately, the Lieberman reform would be shelved in the early 1970s in favor of the 1973 Soviet economic reform. That's hardly a capitalist restoration, if you ask me.
Number 8. The Soviet Union ceased to be socialist under Nikita Khrushchev because he was a revisionist, and his policies undid socialism in the USSR.
Let me continue by first and foremost stating that I am not president of Cornholio's fan club. I do not stan Nikita Khrushchev, and with that being said, it's time for me to take an unpopular stance here on the Marxist-Leninist left. Khrushchev didn't revise anything about Marxism. He didn't write anything about Marxism. He just denounced Stalin in a very cynical, opportunistic ploy to consolidate his own power within the Communist Party. And granted, he certainly did damage the global communist movement with this move. A number of economic problems were arising in which Stalin-era planning was not capable of coping with. So let's talk about some examples of Khrushchevite revisionism, starting with market reforms and decentralization. This is a commonly cited example of revisionism. Khrushchev introduced decentralization as an alternative to market reforms, which were always an option on the table, but were never implemented on his watch. So instead, they did some economic experimentation. Decentral planning was implemented to give enterprises more autonomy in what they produced and how the economy would be planned on a local level. And while it did lead to contradictions between the mid-managers of individual enterprises and the high-ranking central planners, decentralization alone does not implicate a capitalist restoration. Another example, which is commonly cited by Chinese and Albanian communists at the time, was when Khrushchev pawned off state-owned tractors to the collective farms, effectively privatizing state assets, or so they say. In actuality, the Soviets were simply doing away with the old rental model, where the collective farms would borrow the tractors from the state whenever they needed them. All Khrushchev did was sell the tractors off to the collective farms, making them property of the kolkhoz instead of property of the state. So in summary, Khrushchev privatized nothing, Brezhnev privatized nothing, and the real market reforms and restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union actually occurred in 1987 on Gorbachev's watch, with his perestroika reform.
Number 9. Vladimir Lenin said the USSR was state capitalist, and therefore the Soviet Union was not socialist.
This is a very historically illiterate argument. Vladimir Lenin did indeed state the Soviet Union was state capitalist, that is, during the NEP of the 1920s while he was still alive. And the new economic policy was just that, a brief period of synthetic capitalist restoration introduced to build up productive forces and sputter economic development after the Russian Civil War, of course guided by the heavy hand of the Communist Party. A completely reasonable policy at the time given the devastation of the war and lack of productive forces. Workers can't really seize control of the means of production if there aren't really any means of production to seize, in other words. However, after Lenin's passing and Stalin's succession to power in 1924, private property would be abolished in 1928, the NEP would be scrapped, and the first 5-year plans would be drafted and introduced. And as a result, by 1936, all of the industry would be nationalized and socialized, the countryside would be collectivized, and the construction of the world's first socialist regime would be complete.
Number 10. The Soviet Union was an authoritarian regime that silenced political dissent and was ruled by a minority of political elites, and therefore was not socialist.
Socialism is an economic mode, not a structure of political organization. And dictatorship and democracy are not mutually exclusive. If the party elites plus the head of state are all elected representatives of the party, and they share a working class background with the rest of the populace, and are all educated and dedicated Marxists, that by design makes the system far more democratic than anything to emerge out from liberal democracy, especially when you consider the fact that democracy under capitalism is always a choice between lesser evils, and that our political systems are functionally oligarchies in practice since there's virtually no correlation between popular will and policies that are actually put into practice by the government. For example, solid majorities of Americans, when polled, are in favor of free college, single-payer healthcare, a living wage, infrastructure spending, the decriminalization of marijuana, a Green New Deal, and an end to the endless empire building and military adventurism. And yet, despite the fact that all of these issues are highly popular amongst the general populace, whether the person is a self-identified conservative or liberal, none of them get implemented because they contradict the material interests of the ruling elite. So it is in this way that our state apparatus from the bottom up is effectively deliberately designed not to work, and only to address the needs of the wealthy and powerful, and ignore the needs of the general public, and only put up a vague, shallow veneer of democratic control. Conversely, guess what the Soviets did? They provided their people with healthcare, they provided their people with jobs, with education, cheap housing, and good wages that consistently rose over the course of the USSR. They implemented 5-year plans, got the whole country working, consistently improved the economy, which grew boom-bust free for decades, put the first man in outer space, made countless contributions to the realm of human knowledge, and helped many nations across the globe in their own national liberation struggles against global imperialism. And they did this all without having to facilitate a class of greedy, exploitative fucks that would sell their mothers into slavery if it meant making a tiny bit more profit. Many of the negative characteristics that liberals like to attribute to socialism are far more applicable and characteristic of capitalism, from the autocratic political and economic mode to the unfair distribution of wealth, the alienation of the world you feel estranged from, the destruction of culture, the empire building, widespread excess death and suffering, etc. And I just destroyed every argument made by Western leftists to deny the legitimacy of Soviet-style socialism. In the words of the late great Gene Wilder,
"You lose! Good day, sir!"
Originally, I was supposed to produce a video about the French Revolution as the debut to my new series on socialist history. However, due to the absurd amount of overtime that I have been working in recent months, I have had very little time available to my leisure for such things, so thus I have decided to postpone the debut to my new series for the rest of the year, and instead simply prepare the transcripts for them, as to have plenty of content lined up so all I have to do is shoot, edit, and upload the videos in this new series project of mine. Anyways, that is all I have to say right now. I hope this has been informative. If you like this content and would like to provide me with material or critical support, please remember to rate, comment, subscribe, and share with your neighbors. And if you would like to help me in more substantial ways than that, consider donating to my Patreon, the link of which is in the description below. Anyways, that is all I have to say for now. Red salute, comrades.